Kevin Marks couldn't stop shaking. He stood at the edge of a narrow trail in Hocking Hills State Park, heart racing as a terrifying roar echoed through the dense Ohio woods. It came from somewhere off to his left, deep behind a line of tall oaks. He couldn't see the source, but the roar was too loud and too strange to ignore. He clenched his fists and felt the sweat on his palms. He'd hiked alone many times, even in isolated places, but this had him totally confused. It sounded powerful and angry, and his instincts knew that something wasn't right. He had no idea that in less than an hour he would have the kind of moment that makes you stop and rethink everything you believed. His schedule at the small tech company where he worked had been hectic all week, and he was exhausted. But the forecast showed decent weather, and he wanted a quiet place to get away. The cool fall day drew him in too. Hocking Hills always looked stunning this time of year. He arrived just after sunrise, hoping to beat any weekend rush. Stepping out of his sedan, he'd inhaled the crisp air and felt certain the day would be peaceful. Now, only a few hours later, his heart pounded so hard he could almost hear it in his ears. He listened for more noise, trying to pinpoint where that roar had come from. At first, the woods went silent. Kevin peered through thick clusters of pine and oak, scanning for movement. Nothing stirred, yet the air felt charged, like the calm before a thunderstorm. Part of him wanted to turn around, get back in his car, and leave. But ultimately, he didn't. He checked his phone, though he knew reception was spotty in this part of the park. As expected, there was no signal. He considered whether he should shout to see if anyone else was nearby, but just thinking about that roar kept his voice locked in his throat. He decided to move slowly forward, step by step, along the narrow trail. Maybe, he thought, it was just some animal that sounded bigger than it was. But deep down, that roar felt too low-pitched, too unusual to be a coyote. Ohio wasn't teeming with large predators, and black bears typically avoided confrontation. The roar he'd heard had something else in it, some ferocity he couldn't explain. The dryness in his mouth reminded him to stay alert. He adjusted his day pack, made sure the strap was secure, and then pressed on, each step a slow shuffle. As he advanced, tall tree trunks crowded him on both sides, their canopy filtering out most sunlight. He caught the musty scent of wet leaves decaying on the ground. Normally, Kevin found that sound calming, but right now, every rustle made him flinch. His eyes darted to shadows beneath the trees. He told himself to breathe slow, to keep his wits about him. He was alone out here, and the knowledge put him even more on edge. About 15 minutes earlier, everything had been normal. He'd reached a scenic overlook, snapped a few photos of the morning light across the gorge, and enjoyed a granola bar while perched on a boulder. Then he began descending into a valley, hoping to reach a winding creek near the backside of the park. That's when the roar reverberated through the trees and jolted him to the core. It was as if it beckoned him, or warned him, to stay away. As he recalled the intensity of that sound, he noticed how strangely quiet the forest remained. Even the birds seemed to have vanished. He took another step, then paused. He heard a distant thud, like heavy footsteps on damp ground. Adrenaline spiked in his veins. The noise came again, this time accompanied by a faint scraping, as if something large was dragging or being dragged. It sounded off to the left, in a darker patch of underbrush. Kevin swallowed hard. He wanted to see what it was, yet he dreaded actually finding out. He wondered if some large creature was wounded or caught in a trap. But the mental image of a typical animal rescue didn't match the roar he'd heard. Curiosity got the best of him. He drifted carefully off the main trail, making sure to step where the leaves looked less likely to crunch. The slope dipped into a shallow ravine where mossy rocks glistened with morning dew. Suddenly he heard men's voices. It startled him so badly he nearly lost his footing. He crouched behind a broad beech tree, ignoring the mud that smeared his knee. The voices were low and urgent, as if they were trying to coordinate something. He didn't recognize them and couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, but their tone was tense. Kevin stayed still, heart hammering. He peered around the tree, scanning the ravine below. At first he saw nothing but a tangle of branches. Then he spotted movement, a group of men dressed head to toe in black. They stood around something large on the ground, partially covered by what looked like a heavy, dark tarp. He had never seen anything like this in the park. They seemed too coordinated, too prepared to be random hikers. There were 5 of them, all glancing around as if they were on high alert. Just as Kevin tried to puzzle out what they were doing, the tarp started shaking from within. Whatever lay beneath it was alive, and it was big. He heard muffled snarls, the same kind of low, guttural noise that could produce the roar he'd heard earlier. The men struggled to keep the tarp pinned down. One pulled out a black strap, the kind you might see used for cargo tie-downs, and attempted to loop it around the writhing mass. Another man barked orders Kevin couldn't fully catch, something about holding it steady and need more sedation. Kevin's initial thought was that it might be a bear or a feral hog that these men had captured, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this creature sounded too otherworldly. The snarls carried a harsh, reptilian hiss layered beneath the guttural roars. While he was no wildlife expert, he knew enough to realize that nothing in Ohio normally made a sound quite like that. His heart pounded so hard he wondered if the men might hear it. He inched lower, flattening himself behind the beech tree, trying to stay out of sight. The creature convulsed again. From Kevin's vantage point, he saw the tarp balloon upward, as though a huge limb, or possibly a tail, had swung against it. One of the men stumbled back, nearly losing his grip. Another dropped to a knee, pressing all his weight on the tarp. Kevin heard frantic commands. "Get the rope. Don't let it get out." He picked up the edge of urgency in their voices. They were handling something dangerous, something that clearly didn't want to be there. Suddenly, the tarp shifted, revealing a patch of scaly hide. Kevin's eyes went wide. In that brief moment, he saw greenish-brown scales glistening under the faint sunlight that filtered through the canopy. They were thick, almost like armored plating, and definitely not the fur of any bear. The shape disappeared as one of the men yanked the tarp back in place, but the glimpse left Kevin trembling. He couldn't imagine any local species that matched what he'd just seen. It had to be bigger, stronger, and far more vicious, judging by the men's struggle to subdue it. The men spoke to each other in clipped words, occasionally using handheld radios. Kevin picked out phrases like extraction point and secure perimeter. They had a plan. They weren't randomly wandering through the forest. Their black attire and the equipment they carried, coiled ropes, large canvas bags, suggested a professional team. One man reached into a small pack on the ground, pulled out a syringe loaded with a clear liquid, and jammed it through the tarp. Kevin heard a roar that cut through the forest like a blade. The men wrestled it down, and the roaring tapered off to heavy, angry breaths. Kevin's brain scrambled for logical explanations. Could this be some secretive research project? A government operation capturing an invasive species? But no official group would act like they were running from prying eyes. These men obviously didn't want anyone stumbling onto them. The way they scanned the trees told him they were on guard. Kevin scooted back, worried they might spot him, but he couldn't look away for long. Every time the tarp heaved, he glimpsed more of the creature's scaly hide, a ridged spine that flexed like a reptilian dinosaur from a prehistoric exhibit. Then came a sharp crack. One of the men lost his grip on the strap, and the creature's head, or what Kevin assumed was its head, pushed against the tarp. It formed a powerful outline beneath the fabric, revealing a large jaw shape. Another man lunged forward, pressing it down. Kevin watched in horror as rows of what looked like jagged teeth pushed momentarily through the tarp's corner. The fabric tore slightly, but a third man quickly yanked it back into place before Kevin could get a longer look. The men cursed and fought, their boots kicking up wet leaves and soil. The entire ravine echoed with roars, curses, and the shuffle of bodies. At this point, Kevin realized just how dangerous the situation was. If the creature broke free, it could tear through the group. The men clearly had training, but even they seemed rattled. One soldierly figure snarled into his radio, "Sedative wearing off too quick." Kevin heard a muffled response he couldn't decipher, but the man barked again. "No time. We're losing control." There was panic in his voice, and it made Kevin's own fear spike. The men wrestled the tarp again, forcing the creature into a prone position. With enormous effort, they managed to tighten more straps around it. Kevin could see thick coils of rope crossing over the mass. The tarp bunched up in spots, but the men tugged it flat, layering multiple restraints. The creature roared furiously, thrashing its powerful body. Even from a distance, Kevin could feel the tremor in the ground. The men braced themselves, each leaning with all their weight, determined to keep it contained. Kevin found himself inching closer despite the danger. There was something mesmerizing about the raw power displayed by the creature. The scaly hide, the primal roars. It all felt unreal, as if he had stepped onto a movie set. He ducked behind another tree that gave him a slightly better angle. One of the men pulled out a second syringe, jabbing it hard through the tarp. Another round of sedation, Kevin guessed. The creature let out a high-pitched screech that died into a wheezing growl. Slowly, its thrashing subsided to twitching. The men paused to catch their breath, still pressing down in case the sedation hadn't fully taken hold. Kevin could see sweat staining the collars of their black jackets. Their chest rigs and tactical belts were loaded with supplies, not typical for your average forest ranger. A couple of them exchanged anxious looks, as if unsure whether they had the creature subdued enough. One said, "We can't keep pumping it full of tranquilizers. It'll crash." And another responded, "Then let's move faster. The truck's inbound any minute." At the mention of a truck, Kevin froze. If they had vehicles moving in, it meant they'd planned an extraction route. He wondered if they had used a little-known service road or a private driveway that intersected the park's boundaries. The idea that they could move a monstrous reptile out of a public park without drawing attention suddenly felt chillingly possible. If they had planned it so well, they might also have watchers stationed nearby, ready to intercept any curious hikers. Kevin decided he couldn't stay hidden forever. At any moment, they might scan the perimeter and see him. Yet he couldn't help being captivated by the reality of it all. It was one thing to suspect the existence of some undiscovered beast in the woods. It was another to see it forcibly sedated, wrapped in a tarp, and loaded onto an unmarked truck by a paramilitary team. Adrenaline pulsed in his veins, urging him to back up, to hide behind thicker cover. He slowly inched away from the beech tree, careful not to snap any twigs underfoot. He managed to slip behind a fallen log for better concealment. From there, he observed the men in short glimpses. They were now securing the truck bed with high, rigid netting, as if bracing for the possibility of the creature ripping through the tarp. One man pulled a lever in the truck's side and a hidden compartment opened. Kevin saw a glimpse of more equipment, hooks, chains, and a few large canisters labeled with codes he didn't recognize. Everything about this operation spoke of advanced preparation. The new arrival, a driver or second in command, conversed with the one who seemed to lead the capture. Kevin caught fragments of the conversation over the hum of the idling engine. "We have a short window, radio silence, meet at fallback point." They were speaking in a rushed manner, trying not to be overheard by anyone else who might be in the area. Kevin's heart thumped at the realization that they might scan for phones or other signals. Thankfully, his phone had no service out here and was likely not pinging any tower. Otherwise, they could have pinpointed him. At that moment, the creature let out another hissing growl, but it sounded weaker, as though the sedatives were piling up in its system. Two men hopped off the truck bed and joined the others in a defensive circle around the vehicle. They moved with practiced vigilance, each scanning a different sector of the woods. Kevin ducked his head, certain that if their eyes passed over him at just the right angle, they would notice a shape crouching behind a log. His pulse pounded in his ears. Time stretched as the men completed their final checks. Nobody spoke above a murmur. Then, with a few curt gestures, the lead man signaled everyone to their positions. 3 climbed into the cab of the truck, including the driver. The other 4 took a separate black SUV that rumbled into view from behind a stand of trees. Kevin hadn't heard it approach, which meant it was idling close by, maybe waiting for the call. The SUV's windows were equally tinted, giving it a menacing look against the backdrop of fall foliage. Within minutes, the small convoy aligned itself on the narrow dirt path. The lead vehicle inched forward, the truck followed carefully, and the SUV brought up the rear. The men's silhouettes moved behind the tinted glass. Kevin held his breath, waiting to see if they'd do a final sweep of the area. But they seemed focused on leaving quickly, as though lingering posed a risk. Perhaps they worried about park rangers or curious hikers stumbling onto the scene. With engines revving softly, the vehicles rolled out of the clearing and disappeared among the trees. The crunch of gravel faded into the distance. Kevin stayed hidden until he could no longer hear them at all. Only then did he exhale the breath he'd been holding, a trembling sigh of relief. He wiped sweat from his forehead, trying to steady his nerves. For a long moment, he remained crouched, listening for any echo of movement. Everything was still. The forest was eerily silent. Finally, he dared to stand and retrace his steps down into the ravine, drawn by the compulsion to see what traces they'd left behind. He half expected an armed man to jump out, but no one was there. In the spot where the creature had been subdued, he saw large impressions in the muddy ground, deep outlines of boots and what looked like claw marks from when the tarp slipped. There were also bits of rope and a snapped strap. One piece was shredded, the fabric frayed as if a giant blade had cut it. Kevin picked it up, feeling the synthetic fibers in his hands, evidence that a raw, monstrous force had fought back. The earth around the area was churned up, littered with scattered leaves and broken twigs. He saw small droplets of a dark fluid, maybe blood, maybe something else, pooled where the creature must have rolled. He knelt and smelled it, a sharp, metallic tang, different from typical animal blood. It made him grimace. He stood scanning the ground for footprints. Each step the men took had pressed deep into the soil, revealing a methodical approach. But there were no official badges or ID tags, no stenciled crates or papers left behind. They had staged their operation to leave minimal clues. Kevin climbed the short slope to where the truck had parked. The tire tracks were deep and wide, trailing off into the forest. He followed them for a short distance until they veered into underbrush that seemed too thick for normal vehicles. Somehow the men had either cleared a path in advance or had found a route known only to them. Eventually, the tracks disappeared, swallowed by dense foliage. He stood there in disbelief, the enormity of what he'd witnessed sinking in fully. A living, breathing reptilian creature of massive size was now gone, hauled away in a covert operation. He realized with a jolt of fear that if they caught him now, it wouldn't be a friendly chat. They clearly wanted 0 witnesses. Kevin walked back to the muddy clearing, scooped up the shredded strap, and shoved it into his pack. His hands shook so hard he had trouble zipping the compartment. He gulped a few deep breaths, telling himself he needed to get back to the main trail and then to his car. Looking around one last time, he took in the scene of trampled leaves and broken branches, evidence that something huge had fought against capture. A final wave of uneasy chills swept over him. He set off at a brisk pace, retracing his route, sticking as close as possible to cover in case the men circled back. It took him longer than usual to navigate the ravine because his mind raced, thinking about the creature's scaly skin, the men's black uniforms, the weapons, and specialized gear. Every sound made him jump. A snapping twig brought images of them returning, brandishing guns, demanding to know what he saw. He battled the urge to run outright, worried he would make too much noise. Eventually, though, he intersected with the more popular trail. Relief washed over him when he spotted an older couple strolling along, unaware of anything unusual. At least he wasn't alone anymore. He offered the couple a quick nod, trying to hide his rattled demeanor. Then he continued on, passing occasional hikers who had no idea about the bizarre scene hidden away in the woods. Part of him wanted to pull someone aside and babble everything he had just witnessed, but he doubted they'd believe him. It sounded too impossible. Men in black clothing capturing a monstrous reptile, using sedatives and heavy restraints in the middle of Hocking Hills. He resolved to get to his car and think carefully about his next move. By the time he reached the parking lot, his legs felt rubbery. The midday sun shone brightly on rows of cars, yet Kevin felt no warmth from it. He unlocked his sedan and slid into the driver's seat, immediately locking the doors. Setting his backpack in the passenger seat, he rummaged for the shredded strap. It was still there, confirmation that he hadn't imagined it all. He looked at it for several seconds, his mind replaying the sight of the scaly hide, the thrashing under the tarp, and the men's frantic struggle. He started the car and drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting a black SUV to pull out behind him. But the lot looked normal, just a few families in t-shirts and baseball caps heading out to enjoy the day. The two-lane road winding out of the park offered only occasional glimpses of forest. Kevin gripped the wheel, forcing himself not to speed. His heart was still hammering, adrenaline coursing through him like a drug that wouldn't wear off. It felt surreal, knowing that those men might still be somewhere nearby, transporting a dangerous creature to an unknown location. Only later, when he was safe at home, did he let the shock settle. He stared at the strap on his coffee table, remembering how the men moved in precise formation and used advanced sedation. He realized no ordinary group could orchestrate such an operation. It had to be some government-affiliated team, or at least a unit with high-level backing. He thought about reporting it, but who would believe him? And if they did believe him, what would happen when those men found out he'd talked? Fear and confusion gnawed at him. In the end, he hid the strap away and decided to keep silent. He had all the proof he needed that something extraordinary existed out there, and he had no doubt that powerful forces wanted it to remain a secret. So he locked his door, closed his blinds, and tried not to think about what he'd seen. But every time he closed his eyes, he heard that roar, and he knew the world was far stranger than he'd ever imagined. It all started late in the evening this past September, on one of those unnervingly silent desert nights. I was on duty at a small makeshift clinic just off Kelbaker Road, southeast of Kelso, California, near the edge of the Mojave National Preserve. You probably never heard of our place, and frankly, most people haven't. It's basically 2 old mobile trailers retrofitted to handle basic medical cases for folks passing through, plus a small staff area where we sleep on cots if it's a busy night. It normally doesn't get too wild, mostly dehydration, sunburn, cuts from cacti, the occasional scorpion sting, that kind of thing. I'd been here a few months, ever since I decided to step away from the hustle of LA. I wanted to volunteer somewhere off the beaten path, and found a listing through a friend of a friend who works park services. The drive alone, cutting through Baker before eventually winding down to this lonely outpost, can be a meditative experience in itself. Desert roads at night always unnerve me a bit, but I've grown fond of it. This particular evening, I was starting to doze off when I heard the sound of a truck engine outside. It startled me because nobody had radioed ahead, so I got up and tried to straighten myself out, although I wasn't fully awake. The headlights were so blinding they flooded right into the waiting area. I remember fumbling to find a pen or chart because I thought maybe it was a family with a sick kid or an elderly hiker, but there was only one silhouette stumbling toward the door, hunched over in a way that made my spine tense up. A guy walked in, didn't look local, rugged, dusty, disoriented. He said something along the lines of he'd had a run-in with something out near the old T&T Ranch ruins, which I later confirmed are off some back dirt road, mostly known only to hardcore explorers around here. He was dripping so much sweat I initially thought he might be dehydrated. He mumbled that he'd been scratched or bitten. He was holding his left forearm tight against his chest. There wasn't much blood, at least not that I could see through the stained fabric of his jacket, but the way he was shaking had me on edge. I led him to our single bed in the exam room. We don't have fancy equipment, just some standard medical supplies, a small fridge for the basics, a generator that runs lights and AC when it feels like working, and a rudimentary first aid kit with a few extras. As I tried to peel his jacket away, he kept insisting that they were still out there. I figured maybe he was delirious or had been in a fight, but I couldn't get a clear picture because he wouldn't stop glancing around, as if expecting something to burst in at any moment. When I finally got a look at the wound, I had to take a breath. It was a series of parallel lacerations running diagonally across his forearm, like claw marks but oddly spaced. It didn't resemble the typical marks from a mountain lion or coyote, and I've unfortunately seen those before at this clinic. This was deeper on one side and almost tapered on the other, like something had raked across him with a single motion. The edges seemed slightly discolored, almost greenish yellow, which made me suspect maybe some kind of venom or allergic reaction. The flesh around each laceration was raised in ridges, as if something with scales had grazed him. He mentioned in a shaky voice that he noticed an odd shape skulking along the abandoned ranch's perimeter fence. At first he thought it was a stray dog or maybe a coyote. Then he realized it stood on two legs. He said it was tall, thin but muscular, with some kind of ridge around its skull, like a lizard, but bigger, with elongated limbs. He kept referring to it as some reptilian thing. I was trying to remain calm, but inside I was thinking about all the desert folklore, stories of strange sightings near old mines, the rumored secret tunnels out past the mountains, and occasional chatter about reptilian beings underground. I've always dismissed those rumors, chalking them up to tall tales or internet conspiracies. But seeing those gashes, I started rethinking a lot of my skepticism. Before I could even process his story fully, I noticed that the man's jacket pockets were stuffed with dusty Polaroids. I couldn't help but glance at them as I worked to clean his wound. Most were overexposed or water damaged, but a few showed what looked like a collapsed building and large footprints embedded in the dirt. I asked him indirectly if those footprints were from the creature, and he nodded, saying something about how no boots would make prints like that. 3 long toes, a narrower heel, a pattern like scales. The strangest part was when I applied antiseptic. The man let out a yelp, more from surprise than pain, and said it felt like acid on his skin. I've treated plenty of deep wounds, but never saw one react that way to a standard antiseptic swab. The edges of the cuts fizzed slightly, like a mild effervescent reaction. Even after I rinsed with saline, the edges glistened unnaturally, as though the tissue was partially translucent. It wasn't bleeding much. It was more like a thick, dark fluid seeping out. I actually had to double-check our supply kit, thinking maybe something was expired or contaminated, but everything was up to date. It took me a good 2 hours just to get the wound dressed to the point where I felt comfortable enough to let him rest. I strongly recommended he go to a larger facility in Barstow, or even Baker if it was an emergency, but he was adamant about not involving hospitals. He kept repeating that if the government found out, they might make him vanish. Now this is the moment I normally roll my eyes, but the fear in his eyes was real, and I've heard from locals about black SUVs showing up whenever someone stumbles onto certain old testing grounds or weird entrances in the desert. I've never taken it seriously, but I know the Marine bases around 29 Palms and the federal land that stretches out here have their share of secrets. I stepped outside for a moment to catch my breath and gather my thoughts. The night was dead quiet. No breeze, No insects, nothing. My flashlight illuminated a semicircle in the pitch black, and I got that prickly sensation that something was watching me. I swear I caught a flicker of movement near the Joshua trees about 50 yards out. Could have been my imagination, or maybe a coyote, but it was tall, and it moved back behind a rock so fluidly that my stomach sank. I retreated inside and locked the door, something I almost never need to do. I felt ridiculous, like I was overreacting, but better safe than sorry. When I went back to check on the man, he was dozing in a feverish state. I ended up setting up a small IV line for hydration. Throughout the night, he'd shift, mumble, occasionally jerk awake. He kept repeating that there's more than one. At one point, he described them as wearing something like tattered cloth or maybe camouflage that blended into the desert. He said they had eyes that reflected moonlight like a snake's would, but bigger and more intense. He mentioned an underground chamber near the ranch, some half-buried structure with cryptic markings on the walls, symbols he swore looked Mayan or Aztec. But this is north of anything that would typically be connected to those civilizations, so it underscored how bizarre the whole scenario was. By sunrise, he was desperate to leave, insisting he couldn't stay because they'd track him. He thanked me in a rushed, hushed tone and peeled out in his old truck, heading south toward Amboy Road, or so I guessed by the direction. I tried calling out for him to at least keep the wound dressed and watch for infection, but he was gone before I could confirm. I've thought about contacting the rangers or local authorities, but I don't even know what I'd report. A man with weird claw marks who said reptilian monsters attacked him is not exactly standard protocol. I'm reaching out because this entire experience rattled me in a way I never expected. I know you discuss these kinds of accounts on your YouTube channel, and I figured if anyone's heard something similar, you would have, or at least you'd point me toward any resources or previous encounters people might have documented. The desert has all sorts of lore, but seeing those wounds up close and the haunted look in that man's eyes has me thinking about stories of secret bases, underground tunnels, and reptilian sightings that pop up now and again. I always dismissed them as fantasy until that moment. It's been a few weeks now, and I can't shake the feeling that I witnessed the aftermath of something truly out of the ordinary. I have no way to contact the man. He left while half delirious, and there's been no sign of him. Every so often, when I'm on night shift, I scan the darkness outside the window, half expecting to see something hunched by the Joshua trees, watching. I have no explanation for those lacerations and the reaction the antiseptic caused. I have no rational explanation for the footprints in his photos, but I can't deny I saw them with my own eyes. That's basically the whole of it. I'm not sure what else to add, except I'm trying my best to keep a level head. If it was just a mountain lion, that wouldn't explain the weird fluid, the shape of the wounds, or the man's absolute terror, and those Polaroids with the tracks, 3 toes, scaly ridges, as if something straight out of a cryptid documentary were wandering around the Mojave that night.